I think because it's now just gone the hour, we should make a start. I am told that Michael Gove, one of our speakers, is in the conference centre and battling his way through the crowds to come and find us. So hopefully he will join us before not too long. But I wanted to make a start. So firstly, just to say a huge welcome. My name's Sam Hall. I'm the Executive Director of the Conservative Environment Network. And I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors for this event, the RSPB and WWF. We're very grateful for your partnership to be able to make this event possible. We're here today to discuss the question, what does the future of conservative environmentalism look like? Now, lots of us in this room will be familiar with the philosophical case for conservative environmentalism, spanning the works of thinkers like Edmund Burke and Roger Scruton. Lots of people in this room will also know about the strong conservative records on the environment, not only encompassing the fastest rate of decarbonisation in the G7 and the phasing out of coal-fired power stations, which is finally happening today, but also on the natural environment, where we've created this network of marine protected areas around our overseas territories, the Blue Belt, and also started the process of reforming our agricultural subsidies to better reward the work that farmers do to restore the natural environment alongside producing food. And of course, the Conservative Environment Network has built, I think, a vibrant network of conservatives who care passionately about the environment. And at the end of the last Parliament, before we had the election, our parliamentary caucus numbered something around 130 MPs, alongside our network of around 500 councillors and over 1,000 grassroots supporters. But the question we're here to discuss today is not to look back at that record in the past, but to think about where we go next. What are the values of conservatism which we should appeal to and rebuild around as we think about what our platform on the environment should be heading into the next election? What does a conservative environmentalist platform differ from what Labour is putting forward on this agenda? How electorally is the environment going to work for Conservatives? Is it a potential risk for winning back Reform voters who defected from the Conservatives at the last election, or is it essential for winning back other swing voters to the Conservative cause? So lots of things to discuss, and I'm very grateful for the panel for joining us today, who have lots of insights to bring on this topic. To briefly introduce our panel, so firstly speaking will be Jesse Norman, the Member of Parliament for Hereford and South Herefordshire. Since taking office in 2010, he served in ministerial positions, including as Minister of State in the Department for Transport. Next we'll have Rebecca Pow, who is the Member of Parliament for Taunton Deane from 2015 to 2024. She served as the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at DEFRA between 2019 and 2024, and she was also a founding member of the Sen Parliamentary Caucus. Next we'll hear from Dr. David Jeffery, who is a Senior Lecturer in British Politics at the University of Liverpool. And lastly we'll hear from Angela Francis, who is the Director of Policy Solutions at WWF UK. And hopefully, if he arrives in time, we'll also hear from Michael Gove, who's soon to take up the editorship of The Spectator, but of course was also the Environment Secretary in between 2017 and 2019, as well as more recently the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Communities and Local Government. But to kick off our panel, and we're going to invite each of the speakers to give brief opening remarks, try and keep to 3 minutes if possible, so we can get to the questions, which I'm sure we'll have lots of from the audience. But to kick off the panel, I'll hand over to Jesse.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sam, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. What a fantastic turnout. And, of course, it's my great pleasure to be acting as the warm-up act for Michael Gove. Michael, like Gloria Swanson, is probably waiting outside, attending the moment for his close-up, and we wish him very welcome when he comes. He's forgotten more about this topic than I'll ever know, and so has Rebecca Pow. So I'm just going to stick to a couple of things that might be of some general interest to a Conservative audience. I need hardly tell you this is the party of the environment in a way that goes far more deeply than I think you find in any other political organisation in Britain. Why is that? Because at the foundation of conservative thinking is the idea that we're born into a world, and not just a social world and a political world, but a natural world. And it is our job as Conservatives to take that priceless inheritance in its extraordinary complexity and beauty, and if we can, preserve it, enhance it, develop it, and then pass it on to the next generation. And that fundamental trust lies at the centre of the idea of conservatism, at the idea of reforming and improvement that I think is, when the Conservative Party is its best, those are its touchstones. It also, interestingly, if I'm just going to touch a philosophical point, raises a question about justice, because, of course, the Conservative Party is, as a conservative organisation, not always functions as a conservative organisation, but when it does, it sets itself against injustice. And that injustice need not only be to humans. We can think about injustice to animals, and we can think about injustice to future generations. And of course, because we are holding this society and this natural world of ours in trust, we need to think about potentially keeping that sense of proportion as we plan for the longer term, rather than taking short-term adventitious interventions. I think we might make a couple of small points and then I'll stop. One is, markets, if they're properly structured, can be profoundly pro-environmental. And by the same token, state interventions, unless very carefully designed, are very often disastrous to the environment. You only have to spend some time, as I did many years ago. I used to work in Eastern Europe during the communist period. The single worst environmental catastrophe man-made almost anywhere in Europe at the time was the aluminium smelting works just outside Krakow. And that was because communism had no idea of cost and therefore no idea of externality, and they just pumped the stuff down the river. And no one minded about it. And no one was held to account for it because you didn't have independent organizations saying, what about this, what about that? So let's not be too shy about saying that markets, when properly structured, encourage thrift and the frugal use of resources. And therefore, we shouldn't just fall into that trap of saying either or. And by the same token, we shouldn't allow ourselves to stick with a distinction that somehow says state intervention is good because you're spending more money on the environment, and other forms of intervention are bad because you aren't. There are moments where it's a good idea for the state to spend your money, taxpayers' money, in protecting our natural realm, as it would be for our public realm, our social realm, and our political realm. But there are many occasions on which we do not want to do that, and what we want to do is to allow people to look after their communities, to look after what Roger Scruton would call their oikos, their home, and to protect what is familiar and what they hold dear. And when they do that, you very, very often get decisions that are supportive of the local environment, supportive of species diversity, supportive of the natural world. And that's absolutely something we as a party should be supporting. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse, for a very thoughtful opening speech. Hand over to Rebecca next.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jesse. I think you've set the scene really well in a very broad sense, and he shouldn't undermine his knowledge, because he did give me a very hard time about water in the River Wye when I was the Environment Minister, and indeed had water in my brief at one time. So I was asked actually to talk a bit about policy and what we've done, but then to talk about opportunities going forward. So I am just going to remind us all, about just how much we did do on the environment, because I am so proud of the record that we had in government. And the Conservative Environment Network played a very big role in enabling a lot of this and helping a lot of us to raise the issues that we wanted to raise. And in fact, I went to Parliament really to represent my constituency, but to get this stuff on the agenda. And I hope the people in the audience here agree and know how much was done. And I think, first of all, we recognise that we had a lot of ground to make up on the environment, and in its broadest sense, that is, and I include farming too. So let's just whiz through, and here is the Michael Gove that we've all been waiting for. Round of applause. Shall I carry on?
Yes, please.
Are you sure?
Yes, yes.
Yes?
Definitely, yes, please.
I know they're only waiting for you, Michael.
No, Rebecca, you're much more knowledgeable than I am.
Absolute rubbish. So, and here is one of the people that, helped to drive forward all of this policy. So I'm going to rattle through some of it just to remind us. And I genuinely think we did more than any government has ever done on this very broad environmental field, which does include agriculture as well. So it was the biggest win of leaving the Common Agricultural Policy, of course, was to set up the new Environmental Land Management Scheme. And I know Michael was heavily involved in that in the beginning, and what became the Sustainable Farming Incentive. And it's a game changer for the environment, because farmers are now being paid to deliver environmental services, whereas before, and I come from a very long-standing family of farmers in Somerset, they were literally given a cheque just for existing, okay? So now that's a huge step forward, and trust me, actually it is starting to work, and we must not change that. We then had the Agriculture Act and the Fisheries Act, because we'd left the European system, and within that Fisheries Act with a lot of things we could set our own bylaws, for example. That's one of the small things we could do, and in that we did things like we could stop bottom trawling in Lyme Bay, which was destroying our beautiful, I come from quite near there, bay to gather scallops. And now that we work with the fishermen, it's all very sustainable, and it's a whole new world of looking after the environment and, as Jessie says, enabling people to have a living and the economy to work. So we did that. And then, of course, I have to come to the Environment Act. Helena Horton is saying, did you bring the Act? Yes, of course I did. I carry it with me everywhere. Because I was super proud to bring this through Parliament, and it did take 2 years. Because this is a game-changing piece of legislation, which I do not think even the public have realised how much it is enabling and influencing our lives, no matter what the government is. I hope they don't go back and change a lot of it, because it sets the framework for our sustainable future, and that, I think, is something, and in 4 areas: nature, and there's a target in there to halt the decline of species by 2030. And I then went out on the global stage, super proud to have done that for the UK government, and they would say, how did you get that through your Parliament? I mean, it's extraordinary, Michael, isn't it? And similarly, we've got targets for cleaning the air, and then the whole new waste and recycling system is now underway, and the framework was set in this Act. So there's all that, but aside from that, we did a great deal more, just to remind you, and whatever you think about water, and yes, there was a lot to be done, but we did also set up the plan for water, and a lot of this is now finding its way through all the regulation, the changes in the water system structure, the changes to Ofwat, and it's underway. Yes, there's more to be done, but it's definitely there. And we need to build on all this. We brought about the microbeads ban, didn't we? Microplastics, extra protection for hedgerows, ancient woodlands, just a catalogue of things. The Blue Belt gene editing bill, which is going to enable us to create crops that are going to be climate resilient. So all of these things, we've got a tremendous legacy to build on, and the offshore wind. We've got the 4 biggest offshore wind farms in the world. I think we've got 7 of the next 10 biggest ones. So that's a great legacy, and within the legacy, we've set targets to hold us and the next government to account on achieving all these things to improve the environment. So I do hope that stays. We've got an Office for Environmental Protection to hold us all to account, and we've got every new law that's created now has to say how that might impact on the environment. That's a really big step forward with environmental principles and all the rest. But on top of that, we've also got a system that will help us to reach these targets, to restore nature, to clean the air, to have healthier soil. So we've got nature recovery networks, we've got biodiversity net gain in the planning system, and I do hope people are going to hold the next government to account on that, because that's going to help introduce nature into our developments. That's very important. Nature-based solutions are already coming up the agenda, really important. Greening government commitments, and we attracted a great amount of private investment into a lot of these sectors, which, in my view, is something we need to focus on. So, I'm going to make 2 other points now. One is, yes, that's an amazing agenda, isn't it? But one of my absolute bugbears, and I'm really pleased Michael Gove's walked in with his new job, because we failed to capitalise on this amazing agenda. We failed to talk about this in our own election. And I was a bit like a stuck record talking about it, but it was only me. It wasn't enough, Well, and Sen. And so we need to really get that message out more. I did some writing on it over the summer to try and get that back on the agenda, and so that people trust us, so that people care about this stuff. It's how we live. So we need to attract back that trust that we'd already built up, and we'd let it go to other parties. And so I'm looking forward to my new column in The Spectator. But also, one of the real things we need to get the message across is it's not just about net zero and climate change, it's about nature restoration being completely linked to these things. And as a government, we did great work in COP26 to get nature restoration on the agenda. But in my view, we need to build on that more with the energy departments. I'm really not sure the Labour government are understanding this link. And it's something that I think is critically important going forward. And there's a huge economic benefit to this because there are all sorts of stats flying about that if we don't deal with this, the nature restoration side and the net zero, well, 55% of global GDP is attached to nature. And if we don't address it even in the UK, that could have a 12% impact on our economy. So these things are really, really important and they really matter. So I could talk about lots of other things I think we ought to do, access to nature. If everyone was in touch with nature and trees, we could save the NHS 2.4 billion a year. We've got stats coming out of our ears on this, but we need to talk about it. We need to get the media to recognise it. And I think that's how we can find the opportunity for the Conservatives going forward. And we have to link it to the economy, to the fact that we can have a sustainable and growing economy and we can care for the environment.
Great.
I think I'll leave it there, Sam.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That's a really good overview of all the amazing things that the last government did on the environment. I'll now bring in David.
Sure. So I thought I'd make myself very popular by coming to the Conservative Environment Network and then talk about how the environment's not that important for Conservative voters and what the Conservative Party should do around that issue. So if we look at the top 3 most important issues for Conservative voters, the environment comes about 8th. Right? That's compared to 5th for the population at large. If we ask them what the most important issue is, just 1% of Conservative voters in 2019 would say the environment. That's compared to about 8% for the Lib Dems and 10% for Labour. So already organisations like the CEN are pushing, they're pushing upwards hill. This compares to something like, say, 33% for immigration. So the task for Conservative representatives and for organisations like the CEN is to make the environment politically salient for voters. Because as Rebecca just laid out in detail, I've got no legislation to wave about, but as she laid out in detail, there is a record there that the Conservative Party can be proud of. But for most voters, it doesn't quite cut through. That is not the same as saying the issue is not important to them. It's just not the most important. And I think what the Conservative Party need to do is find a way of tying the issues around the environment to other issues that are important. So actually, I said to my mum, I'm doing this panel at the Conservative Party conference on the environment. And she went, oh, the environment? And I was like, well, but last week you were complaining that the river that we walk our dog by was filthy. Or you were talking about the fact that the trees haven't been mowed properly and there's no birds anymore in the park and all of these things. And, oh yeah, I guess I was. And not every interaction with my mum perfectly fits into an anecdote that I can fit into a panel event, but thankfully that one did. There is no doubt that the Conservative Party voter base, both in 2019 and 2024, is the most climate sceptic. And yet, if you go to some panels at this conference, they will tell you to junk net zero. That is a false path, right? Over half of Conservative voters do believe that we need to, that the climate crisis is real, that global warming is real, and about 40% don't, right? That is a coalition that politicians have to manage. Not my job to tell you how to do that, but it's something you have to do. And this idea that all of these voters that we lost to reform, I've got outed myself there as an impartial academic, but that we lost to reform, were often very supportive of things like Ed Miliband's GB Energy. They quite like the idea that you would have a national state electricity generator that worked in the interest of the British people. And so the Conservative Party has to be very, very clever when it stands up and opposes, and it needs to oppose on points of policy rather than points of principle, because actually the public like this idea of a muscular state that does things for the benefit of the British people. And just because the French do things like that doesn't mean we should discount it instantly, right? We should actually sometimes look at what the French do, because sometimes they get it right. We also need to make sure that we don't frame this as a battle between the environment and economic growth, because most of our voters and the voters who went to reform want to see a balance between the environment and economic growth. They don't want us to jettison the environment in the pursuit of like empty GDP that leaves our countryside completely barren, right? They want to see a balance, and it's not an easy task for Tory MPs. But things like net zero, the idea that we should decarbonise the economy by 2050, has majority support amongst Conservative voters. In 2019, the coalition we need to win back, this so-called socially conservative red wall, no, they like the environment and they want to see us protect it. So I guess if I had one message in my 3 minutes, which I note is now closer to 4, sorry Sam, is that actually we turn our back on the environment at our own peril. And it's very easy to bash the environment and get rid of the green crap, but actually a lot of people like the green crap, and we need to do a conservative way of protecting the environment. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Really helpful overview of where the electorate is on these issues and things that Conservative policymakers need to factor in when thinking about our positioning on these issues. We'll go to Angela and then I'll bring in Michael to end. But yeah, Angela.
Thank you, thanks Sam. And I'm speaking here to the whole of the Conservative Party, not the people in this room who I think probably will agree with a lot of things I'm going to say, but you have a battle on your hand, as David just outlined, that some people in the conference are saying we should be jettisoning net zero and jettisoning the environment agenda, and I think that's important to weigh on in thinking about how we take this forward. So the question I was particularly asked to reflect on was enough action taken in the previous Parliament to deliver on our legally binding biodiversity targets and our net zero targets, and what gaps remain? And the simple answer is there wasn't enough done. We were told by the Office of Environmental Protection and the Committee on Climate Change that we were off track to meet those goals, to halt nature loss by 2030 and to achieve net zero by 2030. Those are incredibly stretching goals. They are very, very hard to meet. The question I think we have to ask ourselves is, did we do everything we could have done to get as close as possible? And I think there's some good news in respect of the Conservative Party there. There is a positive record, and Sam, you set some of it out, and you did as well, Rebecca, in terms of what was delivered. You know, the Net Zero target, the Environment Act, monitoring on waterways, the legislation on illegal deforestation, powering past coal, a zero emissions mandate for vehicles, transition plans for businesses, the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was one of the most ambitious in the world, which was signed under the Conservative government, the Public Money for Public Goods, which I'm sure Michael will say more about, which is transformational and world-leading in terms of agricultural change. Those things are really, really worth being proud of, and I would say it's a danger that the Conservative Party might squander that record, because at the same time as those things were happening, there was also a drift and there was also delay. And those, in the minds of voters, confused people about why the Conservative Party stood on this. And so some of that was because we had good targets, but we didn't have action. We had good targets, we didn't have delivery. We did waste 3 years from COP26. We had Glasgow. I think people were really enthusiastic and up for this mission, and then we didn't sort of deliver to them. We had too many battles. I would point to particularly trade agreements where we didn't give farmers confidence that we were going to be supporting sustainable production and asked them to compete with people who weren't doing the same kind of high standards of food production. There was a huge amount of energy wasted, no pun intended, on fracking, a conversation that wasn't scalable, wasn't going to make prices cheaper in the UK. We had the de facto ban on offshore wind, which gifted the Labour Party a very easy win when they came back in. And we had delays and nervousness around whether we would cancel Elms after the amount of work that had been gone on that. And that was in Birmingham here in 2022. That was the conversation we were having at that conference. And so that was also part of the Conservative legacy, and it created huge uncertainty for business. And it has meant that I think other countries have stolen a march on the UK in terms of being a leader on this agenda. And we had an advantage because we had moved first. We have been overtaken in terms of the size of subsidies that have been put forward by the US under the Inflation Reduction Act and the EU under the Green New Deal. That was always going to be the case. Those are bigger markets. They have got more money to spend. We did have a leadership position in terms of having the most consistently supportive policy environment. And the fact we were an open trading nation and we were doing our environmental delivery in a way that was about how we both produced and consumed in an environmental way. That was quite unique and quite special, and I think things that companies appreciated and would have come here for. And we need to get back on track in relation to how the Conservative Party takes that forward. So I would point to three things that I think are gaps and where the Conservative Party might go next. As an environmental NGO, this is what I would like you to do. So, you can take that under advisement. But we are in a climate and nature emergency. And there are times when governments oppose, and there are times where they say, actually, this is something we are consistent on. And you might have different ways of taking forward that agenda, but not to be in opposition on this in the way that we saw around Ukraine and around the pandemic. Is there something that we can get to as a shared, existential threat that all parties agree they need to work on and find solutions together? Could this be an area where the Conservative Party regains the trust of British people by showing actually it's on side on this agenda, it is not trying to be oppositional? I think that's important for the net zero kind of denier bit of the wing of the party that wants to play in that space, but also those who are taking forward the agenda, how to do that in a constructive way. There are a number of targets that you are responsible for setting, where I think the most valuable thing the Conservative Party could do is saying, we are holding you account, Labour government, whilst you're in power until 2028, 29, for achieving those targets, and we want to support you doing that, and we're going to be watching to make sure you do that. The other two things are in respect of land and respect of trade, and we talked about land a little bit and farming and how important that is. Land is one of the only areas we can be a net zero, make net zero real, because it's the only place that can be a sink. And we need to do it in a way that we are using land to remove carbon, to restore nature, and to provide for our food, essentially our nutritional security together. All of those things come together. In fact, you cannot have any of them by themselves. The biggest threat to our food security, the UK's food security report said, is our loss of nature. That is going to be an issue that we need to resolve. We need to resolve in our farming sector. So the UK WF is calling for a Living Planet Act, which shows how our plans for land add up to delivering all of those three things: addressing climate, restoring nature, and delivering food, and make sure we're managing the trade-offs. And importantly, we're not doing that in a way we're just offshoring the responsibility to do any of one of those things to another country. So we are not expecting somebody else to restore nature when we're not doing it. We're not expecting others to deliver major carbon sinks when we're not doing it. We are not expecting somewhere else to deliver our food when we aren't sorting out those problems ourselves. And then the final part of that, and also related to food, is trade. We need to make sure our trade policy is consistent with our domestic policy. We can't, and I think there was people were here for the earlier conversation, Graham Stewart was talking about carbon border adjustments. The way we compete in the world is going to be judged by how well we produce. Environmental production is going to be a factor that's going to be a factor that affects what we export to other countries, and how companies decide who wants to be in their supply chain, because that will make you resilient, it makes you efficient, it makes you what the customer is looking for, and it makes you suited to the regulatory environments that we're all facing. We have got the start of measures appearing in carbon terms, but we haven't got many measures appearing in respect of nature. And for agriculture, that's really, really important. And WF is again asking for core environmental standards that ensure that the UK's food imports are meeting minimum environmental standards that we set for our own farmers, so that we're buying the best from the best of the rest of the world. We do want to compete. We do want to buy what's being produced well, but we don't want to ask farmers who are asking here to be more resilient, be more sustainable, to do that at the same time as they're having to compete with others who aren't doing the same. So I will stop there. But yes, a plea for the people in this room to take this message to the rest of the conference, because we think it's incredibly important that the Conservative Party is showing up on this conversation.
Great, thank you very much, Angela. And now Michael.
Thank you very much. You don't really need me, because you've heard it all and better from others. So the thinking, the intellectual case for taking the environment seriously, Jesse will have explained. And even though I wasn't in the room, I am prepared to bet, knowing Jesse, that he was able to invoke the full panoply of Conservative thinkers from Burke to Scruton in order to explain the centrality of the environment and the principles of stewardship that runs like a golden thread through their writing. And the fact that just thinking about the environment, thinking about place, thinking about rootedness, thinking about home is a distinctly Conservative tradition. I was here for Rebecca, and Rebecca, while Jesse did the thinking, Rebecca did the doing. I just took the credit. Rebecca was the person who was at the coalface, no pun intended, in parliamentary terms, and the person who also ensured that we were staying close to the wishes and concerns of the electorate, and staying close to Conservative principles and forging ahead on the environment. David has explained to you why it's electorally in the Conservatives' interests to take these issues seriously. And I'd say just one thing as a footnote to that. The UK has, per capita, a higher membership of nature conservation and wildlife and other related charities than any other country on earth. So from the National Trust to the RSPB to WWF, and indeed SEN, membership of these organisations saturates British society. And the overlap between membership of these organisations and membership of the Conservative Party is significant. Whether it is the RSPB or the National Trust, these are institutions which are naturally about conserving and naturally attract Conservatives. But Angela has also stressed to us that while we have done a lot, there is a lot still to do, while there's much that we can be proud of, there are future challenges ahead. And in particular, I want to thank Angela because the work that WWF is doing at the moment gets to the heart of something which I think is critically important to understanding the environment, politically and in policy terms, which is that you have to see it as a system. The work that Angela's doing, pointing out that you can't tackle the anthropomorphic climate change on its own, that you also need to think about landscapes, nature and biodiversity. And you also need to think about food security and the economic welfare of our farmers and land managers in one is absolutely right. Similarly, when Rebecca and I were at DEFRA, we recognised that you needed to have interlocking, not just parallel, interlocking policies on waste, on the quality of our rivers and what the water companies were doing or should be doing to them. But also, you needed to have marine protected areas in order to ensure that the blue belt was there so that the whole ecosystem worked appropriately. You needed to have an interlocking policy on air pollution. You needed to have a means, as we discussed, of shifting the subsidy, the government money that goes to farmers in a way to incentivise them, through public money for public goods, to invest in nature restoration. The best farmers, the overwhelming majority of farmers, care deeply about nature, but the money that the government was giving them was based purely on the size of the land holding. So we were giving money to dukes, nothing against dukes, love dukes, but irrespective of what they did, rather than concentrating on enhancing the environment. So it was, pick your metaphor at will, but it was an interlocking jigsaw, or a Meccano construct, a Terry's chocolate orange, in which everything had to come together in order to make sure that you had proper policy. And that takes me to where we are now. My worry about the government is that their environmental policy is a penny farthing. So a tremendous amount of ambition on climate and decarbonisation, but almost nothing on nature. And again, we can critique some of the aspects of Ed Miliband's policy, but one of the things that is a concern is that I know that, and I have to be careful about this, someone whom both Angela and I know was talking to Labour politicians a little while back and saying, you know, you should really be thinking about maintaining the investment in environmental land management contracts. It appears as though you're being tempted by the Treasury to cut that. And the Labour person said, look, with everything Ed Miliband is doing, we're going to be the greenest government ever. So, you know, we shouldn't have to worry about that. And that's completely the wrong way of looking at the environment. If you just look at carbon as the goal, and if you tell companies that their ESG responsibilities are discharged purely by dealing with energy and not with a broader environment, as I say, you have an unbalanced and, to my mind, unconservative approach. And therefore, I think it's important for us, of course, to have a critique of some of the things that Ed Miliband may be doing. I think he's actually making the climate transition more difficult by starving some of the companies that we need of capital there, and we can make that critique. But as we make that critique, we shouldn't say that it is wrong to seek to decarbonise the economy, and we certainly should also say that the missing element, more than just an element, more than just half of the equation, the missing part of the landscape is the landscape. And that we are the party that introduced, as Rebecca reminded us, through both legislation and the 25-year Environment Plan and their parallel targets, a level of ambition there. We created the incentives in cash terms, and we also created, much to the chagrin of some of my colleagues, the Office of Environmental Protection to keep us honest. And having done all of those things, we are in a stronger position to be able to say that we are the party of nature, wildlife, and the environment as a system overall.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Those are excellent opening speeches to start our discussion. I'm going to take some questions now from the floor because we've got such a big audience that I'm conscious of hogging the time here on the top. So, Katie, do you want to maybe bring the microphone to the gentleman on the third row?
Hi, thank you. Mark Tinsley, ex-banker, now a farmer in Shropshire. Firstly, I'd like to say how well I think SEN have delivered a great range of speeches over the course of this conference, and I think it really highlights the great opportunity that the Conservatives have of bringing environmental issues into the centre of the party. So thank you for that. And also I think it's interesting to show the great diversity of people of different ages and different backgrounds who are attending the SEN events. But I think the Conservatives can show a strong foundation of the work that's been done over the last 10, 14 years. Great foundational work, but I think there's a great opportunity here for the environment, and the Conservatives need to think about what the commercial opportunity is. We've been entertained this week actually by a German offshore wind company who are developing all of our wind farms around the offshore wind farms around the UK.
Could I push you to a question? Sorry
Yeah.
for your very kind words about SEN. I don't want to rush you.
Sorry.
But just conscious of all.
Just finally, just to say that we've got French companies providing gas and electricity, and we've got Chinese and French providing our nuclear. So while we're good on ideas, I just think we need the opportunities for Conservatives to show the commercial opportunity, and what does the panel think about that?
Thank you very much, and thank you again for your generous comments about SEN's programme. We've got lots more events for people that are still looking to fill their fringe programme up. Let's take a couple more and try and do them in batches. Let's go to the left-hand side, the lady on the second row.
Hiya, Sienna Summers from Friends of the Earth. My question is, if you were elected Conservative Party leader, what would be the one thing you would do over the coming months to demonstrate environmental leadership in opposition?
Great, and let's do one more. The gentleman straight behind.
Hi, Hugh Beaumont, current banker, aspiring farmer. I'm going to ask a question which I'm sure lots of other people in the room have on their minds. Britain has done a lot of good things in the environmental space, but of course a lot of emissions are produced by nations which are currently industrialising. What can we do to incentivise those countries to adopt environmental policies? Is there a space for Britain to learn something from France and perhaps operate more green, say, nuclear plants in foreign countries? I'd like to hear some thoughts on that.
Great, thank you very much. So in the interest of trying to get through more questions, I'm going to put a question to each of the panellists so that we don't repeat lots of the same ground. So perhaps starting with that last question about how we can get other countries to be doing more on the environment as us in the UK. Maybe bring in Angela on that, given that's an area that WWF have done a lot of work on.
You read my mind. That's what I was going to go for as well. It's a really, really good question. You know, we are as part of a global challenge, so we have to do things in the UK that are leading to a transition in the rest of the world. So the part of that is solidarity and working with other nations. It's also part of it is identifying some of the really tricky challenges that we need to solve. So we have a lot to be proud of in terms of renewables and making that some of the cheapest electricity in the world, because now you don't have to work so hard to have other countries take that up. It's automatically a technology they want to deploy because it's cheap and possible for them to do so. Similarly, working out how you tackle flooding, how you grow food and farming in such a way that will be more resilient to extreme weather is also something the UK can do and export. So I think you're right in identifying that we have got a mission. I think the world, we already know that we have been lacking UK's leadership in this space. The rest of the world wants the UK back on the international stage and leading in this space. So I think there's a lot that we have done. that we can be proud of. And I think having past ministers, people who've been working this agenda, talking to that international community in the COPs coming up in Brazil, alongside current government, will be incredibly powerful to show that this is not an area that the UK is split on, and we see it as part of our economic future. There is no route to delivering a strong, prosperous economy that isn't based on delivering net zero and nature positive.
Great, thanks so much, Angela. And now to turn to you, Jesse, to maybe pick up that second question around what would you like to see the next Conservative leader do on this agenda?
Well, of course, the trouble with being Conservative at the moment is that you haven't got any power. So there are two things we can do. The first thing, obviously, is to lead a national campaign to clean up the River Wye. Absolute outrage that it's been allowed to get to say it has. The second thing I would do is actually just take the fight to the opposition on the whole Miliband agenda. I mean, what is this UK energy thing? It feels to me like a very expensive way of adding additional cost to stuff we're already. I set up the UK Infrastructure Bank when I was at the Treasury, £22 billion balance sheet, designed with a double mandate, which is zero carbon or low carbon and infrastructure development. So deliberately trying to put some tension into there to get us to think as cleverly and as well as we can about different places, different sectors where we can look at the leading edge and really start to make that work and bring forward some of the technologies Angela's talking about. Okay, I have no idea what Miliband's got planned. It sounds like that, plus a lot of additional money that you're paying for, plus a lot of additional costs, which will just be waste. So let's see some actual plans and see, and then we can judge it. But at the moment, it feels like a lot of politically advantageous hot air.
Maybe, Rebecca, if I put that same question to you as well, what would you like to see from the next leader?
So I think Jesse makes some really good points, which I completely support. I definitely think that I want to see, and I think there's a bit of an event on this later, I want to see understanding from our next leader that it's just what we referred to on the panel. It's not just about net zero and climate change. It has to be about this holistic approach. And there has to be an understanding that this is not detrimental to the economy, but it will benefit the economy. But that does mean just not always being short term. We have to look at the bigger picture, and that touches on Michael's point about systems, this holistic approach. And I really want to hear that from whoever is our next leader. And I know that it might be number 8 in Conservatives' areas of interest, but that's why I made the point earlier about just things like access to nature and focusing on some of those things. That can save our NHS money. So if we have to give examples, and you can find that across departments, whether it's in working with prisoners or whether it's in education. If we get it right and get the message right about net zero and nature restoration and the benefits to the economy, I think that's really what we've got to do. And we mustn't get lost in thinking that it's negative to work on the environment. So look at Teesside is a great example of where the free port status was given, those tax benefits, but actually they're going to have a fantastic net zero legacy, and I'm hoping they're working in nature and all the net gain as well, and I certainly went to talk to them about their soil. So there is definitely a way, isn't there, a Conservative way, and I want to hear our next leader really making that as important as all of this focus on immigration.
Great, and then Michael, maybe you might pick up that point about the commercial opportunities from environmental leadership and whether we're doing enough to grasp them and whether they're materialising in the way that we'd hope.
Yes, I don't think that we. I think it was a very fair point, and I don't think that we have. We allowed our expertise in the nuclear industry to run down over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades. And as has been brilliantly brought out by Sam Bowman, Samuel Hughes and Ben Southwood in their recent pamphlet Foundations, the costs of establishing new nuclear are dramatically more here than they are in France or in South Korea. It is also the case that there are commercial opportunities in agri-tech as well, a point that was made on another panel that I was on earlier by Danny Kruger. One of the reasons why gene editing is so important, it's often the case that people on probably the greenish wing of politics have concerns about GM or gene editing. One of the reasons it's so important is exactly as Rebecca pointed out, there could be another Norman Borlaug style green revolution where you get significantly more yield without depleting their natural environment without harming soil quality, without needing herbicides, pesticides, and other chemicals. And there are other ways in which, even when you do use those chemicals, they can be precision applied so that the health of the soil is enhanced. So it is certainly an area in which we lead, and one of the ways in which we can continue to do so is to continue to invest in our very best universities, from the RAU to UEA, and continue to incentivise farmers to move towards these methods of production. And in answer to the question from our friend from Friends of the Earth, there are two things I would want the Conservative leader to do. One is to tell the truth about the boondoggle that Drax is, and the second one would be to double spending on elms.
Very good. Same with that behind those. Right, next set of questions. Let's go with Helen, otherwise she'll never forgive me.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, will you still publish Climate Denial when you're the editor of The Spectator, as has been published in the magazine in the past? And also, what do you all think about the rhetoric of some of the leadership candidates who don't seem to think that the environment is very important? Thank you.
Great, let's take a couple more. The gentleman there on the third row. Katie.
Thank you. Similar to the previous question, what do we say to members of this party who are not so keen on the idea of net zero and decarbonisation? I think David made this point about not attacking the principle, about the policy. How do we communicate this idea to those members?
Great, and then the gentleman over there. Oh, no, sorry, Katie, on the second row, on the far left.
Yes, hello, David O'Rourke from the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts. Tom Tugendhat said about an hour ago that he does not accept the term climate emergency, touching on some of these other questions. I'm quite confident if I went on site with him somewhere, he'd be very enthusiastic, and the other candidates would too, about their local place, their woods, their grasslands, their peat beds and rivers. So why do you think there is that disconnect in certainly the rhetoric at the moment in the Conservative Party around climate affecting nature, and as Rebecca and Michael said, then nature affecting the economy?
Great, some good questions there. Probably should start with Michael to pick up Helena's question, if that's all right.
The Spectator will continue to publish articles from a huge variety of perspectives, covering every conceivable issue, and the thing that will characterise all of the articles will be wit, insight, and fidelity to the truth. And I hope, Helena, that you'll be able to write for us on that basis, because your writing has all of those qualities. On the other points, I think one of the things, there are two things for Tories that I think have led to a greater degree of scepticism or unhappiness with some of the claims that are made. The two things, just speaking for myself and my circle, quite a small one actually, of acquaintances, is one, cost is an issue. So at a time of the cost of living crisis, if one looked, for example, at replacing gas boilers with air source heat pumps, the cost as directly experienced by hard-pressed citizens leads to a reaction against, as we've seen in Germany and elsewhere. The other thing also is the sense that the scale of the challenge is so huge that you need an effective revolution. So please forgive me for mentioning Greta Thunberg's name, but the way in which some of the rhetoric that has been deployed by her and her supporters recently will just put Conservative backs up. And Conservatives like to be persuaded and moved, but they dislike being hectored and dragooned. And so, even if we sometimes sound as though we're hectoring ourselves. So those are just 2 points.
On our previous panel about net zero, it was Lord McInnes who said that Conservatives need to use a bit less Greta Thunberg and more Simon Clarke when talking about net zero, which I thought was a good bit of advice.
Exactly.
Maybe, David, if I could bring you in next to pick up that point about some of the scepticism we've heard at the conference around the environment, and I know you've done some research at Conservative members' attitudes and how that might differ from the electorate, and how would you advise leadership candidates to go about managing those two things, given they're inevitably going to be focused on that sort of smaller electorate at the moment?
Yeah, what's really interesting is that actually Conservative voters are massively supportive of renewable energy. So solar, tidal, offshore wind, hydroelectric, even onshore wind has about 70% support amongst Conservative voters. And that's when we need to remember that the members are not necessarily representative of the voters. And that's a problem when members, influence MPs and things like that. And obviously members have a vital role in the organisation, but it's also on members to recognise that they and the people they talk to might not necessarily be representative of the people they need to vote for them or to vote for us. And I think what Michael just said then about hectoring is really important. So we have 63% of Conservative voters who support reducing, getting to net zero by 2050. But we only have 20% who support the current government's plans because they see them as going too fast and being too expensive. When you see the cost on your energy bill, you're less likely to support something. It's basic cost-benefit analysis. And I think some of the really easy ways, as we read in that essay that you just mentioned then by Sam Bowman and colleagues, we're not good at building nuclear, but that is the obvious answer. It is low carbon. There are some issues, but none of them are insurmountable. The French can do it. I return to my previous point. If the French can do it, if the South Koreans can do it, we need to get the planning system to be agile enough to accommodate these things. And remember, 57% of Conservative voters support nuclear. Yeah. So it's pushing at an open door. You can make the argument. And again, I've just sat here and just spat a load of statistics at you, but it is the job of Conservative politicians and Conservative organisations to craft a narrative, to convince people. Sorry, no pressure. Yeah, and if not, just hit them with the Environment Act.
Yes,
that'll win them over. It's quite a weighty tune.
I usually find
but yeah, if it's their job to say why this is for our benefit and not just focusing on the negatives. Yeah.
Great, and maybe last of that set of questions, if I come to Jesse to pick up that point, the question over there about how we can use people's love of their local place and their local environment to try and encourage that greater consciousness about environmental issues, including issues like climate change.
Well, I think you've already said it very well. I'm not sure that much more needs to be said about this. I mean, as Michael's pointed out, voluntary organisations are saturated with Conservatives, and Conservatives saturate environmental organisations as well. And on Friday, I have a 2.5-hour meeting with the Friends of the Y, in which I'm going to have to try and explain to them, and more pleasingly, the new Labour MP for Monmouth and the new Labour MP for the Forest of Dean are going to have to explain to them why Steve Reed has been so comprehensively hopeless in picking up this issue. And, of course, the River Wye, the Friends of the Wye, is heaving with small C Conservatives who, I'm pleased to say, in South Herefordshire, did their duty last time round, but failed to do so elsewhere. And what is the solution to this? The solution is always the same. It is to give people authority and opportunity and meaning, and then invite them to step forward. And there's absolutely no reason at all why we in government could not have done more of that. I think we absolutely could have done. I think we're very, very good at the big policy areas. I think we're possibly less good at thinking about how we mobilise some of those citizen efforts in a way that we could have done. But, that's a whole new agenda, which I'm afraid is a million miles away from the state-first approach that we're seeing from the government.
Great. Another round of questions I think we've got just about time for before we wrap up. Let's take James over there. Katie on the third row. Fourth row.
Thank you. James Cooper from the Woodland Trust. Anybody attending this conference, or indeed the conferences the last few weeks, would see that planning, house building are dominating the agenda. They're really big themes. And, there's a lot of talk of deregulation. And, Michael, I heard you talking about the Victorians and how they were optimistic about how they could build better. What should a Conservative environmentalist approach to that debate be? And how can it also guide restoring nature at the same time?
Great. Big question to in the last few minutes to bring up. Graham at the back. Yeah, if that microphone works, go for it.
It works. I think it works. Yeah. Good. Graham Simpson, I'm a member of the Scottish Parliament. Very easy question. Should there be a register of ancient woodland? I ask that because there isn't one in Scotland. And should ancient woodland enjoy the fullest protection from any sort of development?
Great. Let's take one more then. Yes, the lady there. Yes.
Hi, thank you. I'm Aisling from Blue Marine Foundation. Thank you, Rebecca, for talking about the brilliant work in the Fisheries Act on the offshore MPAs. But the Fisheries Act also said that we should be setting our fishing quotas in line with scientific advice, which is something that we haven't really seen happen. And I just kind of would be grateful for the panel's thoughts on how we can make sure we're properly managing our fish stocks.
I think maybe let's just squeeze in one more, because I saw Alyssa had a hand up at the front, and was one of our Sen ambassadors. It would be good to hear from Alyssa.
Thank you. Alyssa Swingler's Herefordshire Council Deputy Leader. What would the panel think about rights for nature? Is that a way of addressing the penny farthing that Michael addressed?
Great. So we've got a question there on what the Conservative approach on planning should be, a question about protections for ancient woodland, a question about whether we're living up to our sustainable fisheries promises through the passage of the Fisheries Act, and then lastly a question there about rights for nature. I might let the panel choose which of those questions they answer, and then also let people do any final remarks they have. We don't have very long, so people try and keep to a minute or so. But yeah, maybe start with Rebecca. That's all right.
Cool, there's quite a range of questions there. I potentially, I just must mention on the fisheries though very quickly. We did do an amazing thing, which was to ban the sand eel fishing on Dogger Bank, and we really stuck our necks out on that. We could only do it because we had our own Fisheries Act, and you will know how unpopular that is and how we've now got European countries trying to take us to court for that. So that demonstrates just how hard these things are, even if you have your own laws. So we are going into battle, and I would be the first person to say all quotas should be based on scientific evidence, and in fact a great amount of the negotiation is based on scientific evidence, and we've just allowed the new bluefin tuna fishing, the recreational fishing, that was based on scientific evidence, and that people are allowed to get licenses now and do the fishing, and they have to put all the fish back and so forth, and that's a very good example, I think, of what could and should be done. Very quickly, ancient woodland, we got the expert James over here. Of course Scotland should have a register, shouldn't they? And actually, we did do a lot as a government to get more protection for ancient woodland, but I would be the first person to say it needs a little bit more. I think I'll end it there, Sam.
Great, thanks so much, Rebecca. Maybe Angela comes to you next. I don't think you'll pick up the rights for nature question. We'll pick another one if that wasn't what you were thinking. But,
Thank you. Yeah, so on the planning question and the ancient woodlands a little bit, I think it comes back to this land point. Like, how are we ensuring that the policy instruments that we've got and the incentives that act on landowners are encouraging them to do the things that will result in us having our nature restored, land function as the carbon sink that we know it can function as, both in woodlands and in agricultural soils, and that we get the food security we need. Getting that right, I think, will give people a lot of comfort that we are going to give up some land for housing, and we are going to put some pylons in some places. Those things are not the biggest drivers of nature loss, but they are very controversial and worry people enormously when there is no path to restoration. And I think if you set out a way that you are going to, with an enhanced land use framework, really be very serious about how you're going to have a restoration plan, I think a lot of communities, although I'm sure there will still be fights in various areas, will say, we recognise also there is need for housing as well. And I think it comes back to my kind of sum up point for this panel as well, is we need to do nature, net zero, climate change, nature restoration as the context of everything we do. It is not a separate mission. So, for me, I'm not overly worried it's 8th on the list. But what I'm worried about is that we can't walk and chew gum at the same time. There is no plan for delivering the economy or for delivering the NHS that isn't also thinking about how we do those things. And it's just got to be the context for everything we do. And there are questions that are asked of us as NGOs and as policymakers, which are the really hard questions about how do you make this work for people. And we have to answer them with policy, not just by going slower. So I'm incredibly sympathetic with the idea that we just need to slow down for people, because actually it just gets more expensive. It just gets harder for people. The people who will be in the drafty houses, in the houses that overheat, that will suffer from respiratory diseases, are all the people who are most vulnerable. So there is no answer that is just go slower and let people off. You're actually making it worse. And we also lose all of the opportunities to take advantage of the economic advantages that will come from moving on this faster. So my plea is that we walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think I haven't got a way of getting this in, but I just wanted to say I was thinking through the whole conversation, last round of conversations, of Lee Cairns' analysis of Boris Johnson in the COVID crisis, that it wasn't the right crisis. So this is the crisis we are presented with. We just need to be able to respond to it. It might not be what you thought you were going to do when you went into politics, but we just need to do it. And you do it at the same time as you do everything else. And that is the world we're in. And yes, it's incredibly important. It's not, I don't think, a dogmatic mission that supersedes everything else, but it's something that we have to do. And I think most of the voters agree and want to find ways that we find ways through problems rather than sort of throw our hands up and say we can't deliver.
All right, thanks Angela. Jesse.
Tragically, I'm already a minute late for my next event, or 3 minutes late. So I'm going to keep it very quick. Pleasingly, 3 minutes into overtime, I rather disagree with Angela. So it's nice to be able to put that straight down on the table. I don't think Tories like the words emergency, not because they don't think there's a serious problem, but because they don't want to be hectored, as Michael has mentioned. And I personally like reform because it gives people a chance to organise themselves and prepare. There's no reason for thinking that going fast is better for technology change than going slow. I mean, the genius of technology change is you try to go at the maximally effective speed for the technology. I've seen Conservative ministers over the last 15 years who are idiotic techno-optimists thinking that technology will solve a problem where so many other issues bear on it that I'm extremely sceptical about people who tell me how fast or slowly to make change. We should make it as fast as we can, all things considered. That's what proper government's about. Couple of quick things on this. The Woodland Trust point, listen, a systemic approach to land ownership would be great. We have a place in Herefordshire where the street is called Watery Lane. That's been targeted for an enormous housing development. It's 50 yards from the River Wye in a floodplain. Ask yourself this question: is it an intelligent decision to put 1,000 houses near Watery Lane? Okay, that's the second thing I would say is, if you're going to do that, why not have local authorities who actually have enough money to run a planning enforcement system? Which is a serious further problem, because at the moment what we're saying is basically fill your boots and we're not going to check up on it, and that's no good at all. A systemic approach, as Michael said, is correct. Protection for woodlands, yeah, qualified protection for ancient woodlands, absolutely. You don't want one ancient tree to obstruct something sensible for community benefit, but you absolutely want a proper qualified protection. Final point, it's really about rights for nature. Rights work if they're enforceable. Trees cannot enforce their own rights. We can't abrogate responsibility by calling something rights for nature unless we're putting in place a strong enforcement mechanisms that allow human beings to act on behalf of those things. In the name of the injustice, the remedy of injustice that I started out talking about, there's a little trick here we need to be careful about. When we talk about science, we're in a world of cost-benefit analysis. When we're in a world of emergency, we're in a world of taint and either-or. We have to make a decision about how we play between those two value sets as we frame decisions, and I think a smart conservatism is musical on both, but doesn't necessarily allow themselves to go either one way or the other, in part because they're just trying to maximise, they're trying to do the right thing, all things considered. That doesn't always tell you what the right answer is. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Michael?
I'm going to conserve energy and tread more lightly on the planet by saying that I agree with what Jesse has just said, and I have nothing more to add.
Very good, very concise. David, last word to you.
Last word to me. I think we have just had our bottoms handed to us in a general election, and we are not in a position to tell the public how fast we should be going on this agenda. What we need is a bit of humility and a message from the next leader about how and why we will preserve the environment for the next generation. And I hope it's a sensible message, and I hope it's not just a reflexive disregard of net zero, of things like onshore wind farms, and I hope it takes into account what our winning 2019 coalition believes in. as well. And I'll end it there because I know Jesse's late.
Great, thanks very much, David. And our next panel, please stay with us in half an hour's time. Costing the Earth, what is a Conservative approach to green investment? So if you want to know what the Conservative answer is to GB Energy and similar things, please stick around for that. But it just remains for me to thank our sponsors, RSPB and WWF, and our speakers. And sorry for keeping you a few minutes over.